Welcome back to RECO12, the Journey in Recovery series. My name is Justin, and I am the host of this RECO12 podcast. And back in 2019, I was hosting another podcast called Journey Through Life. It was a long-form conversation or interview-style podcast. It was not recovery-related, although I was actively working my recovery then. During this time, I felt compelled by my higher power to do a series on the Journey Through Life podcast called Journey in Recovery. In this series, I interviewed 16 people over a 3-month period of time on each of the 12 steps of recovery. It was during this 3-month period of time that my own recovery walk was radically changed, and my vision of what the steps can do for anyone, anywhere, from any background, was drastically opened up. It was just after this series that the idea of the RECO12 Speaker Meeting podcast came to be. It was in this series that I realized just how powerful the steps of recovery are. It was in this series that my higher power opened up huge new ideas to me, such as the concept of lowercase g God turning to uppercase G God, which is much of what will be discussed in this episode today with Harvey E. I also learned about two-way prayer and many other things that just revolutionized my own walk with God and with my fellows in recovery. During the month of December of 2022, I am replaying those episodes of the Journey in Recovery series with minor edits and rebranding so that the listening audience can get more background on several of our RECO12 guests, who in this setting will have more time to share their stories, as well as to get introduced to others who have not been RECO12 guests, and also to learn more about how the problem is so similar, no matter the addiction, and how the solution is the same, no matter the addiction. Now, to donate, to contribute, to participate in our RECO12 community, we've got WhatsApp group, we've got YouTube, we've got a Facebook page. To get that information, go down to the show notes and get involved there. And let's jump in and hear Harvey E. Get introduced to him in a way that he has not been able to do in the RECO12 appearances that he has had. I love this man, and I'm grateful for him and his influence in my life. Here we go. Now, today we will hear the first part of a long and very meaningful conversation I had with Harvey E. in Toronto about Step 2. Harvey and I became fast friends in this conversation, as I had only had one previous 1 or 2 minute conversation with him. I loved the manner in which he discussed Step 2, in which he openly discussed his own experience in addiction and his own journey in recovery. And I love the way that he related that how his sponsor walked with him through Step 2. And I love Harvey. And I think you may also grow to love him and his experiences, strength, and hope as he walks through the depths of hopelessness and powerlessness towards a dim light that was shown him about 6 years ago. And now that light is bright and full of warmth. This week will be a 2-part episode. I will release the second part of it on Thursday. So keep your eyes and ears open for that one, as you don't want to miss either one of these. In this episode and others in this series, you may be introduced to concepts that you have never before considered, or may even seem contradictory to what you have considered truth for perhaps your whole life. But these concepts are shared as honestly and openly as possible, using real experiences that cannot be denied as being true. While you listen, take mental or physical notes of ideas of self-improvement that pop into your head. Then, at the end of this podcast, review those notes and make a plan about how you can implement them. Now, kick back, or hit the road, or do house or yard work, or whatever you do while listening to podcasts, and be ready to learn and feel and gain insights like you may have never considered before. Here we go with Harvey and Step 2. All right, Harvey. Well, I'm really excited to do this. As you are aware, because you and I have talked a little bit about this, I'm excited to do this little mini series of the Journey Through Life podcast that I'm calling Journey in Recovery. So, Harvey, introduce yourself to us. And then we'll go a little bit into your background story and what's important to you in recovery.
Okay, so I'm Harvey. I'm a grateful recovering sexaholic, a good person worthy of recovery, as I like to say. And that's part of my self-affirmations that I've learned to live with and use on a regular basis, as often as I can. I am 65 years old, just celebrated my 65th birthday in September.
Awesome.
I'm married with 5 married children, 18 grandchildren, 2 baseball teams, a male and a female baseball team. And I live in Toronto and I practice dentistry because I have to, because I have all these children and grandchildren to help out. So I still practice and, I'd like to continue to do so as long as I feel that I'm still being of service and helping my patients. So that's who I am.
That's the basic background. Well, very cool. It's neat that you've got such a big family, and we'll get a little bit into that. I think a little bit later. I want to talk about the family dynamic in recovery and how that works in your own life. But I want to talk a little bit about your own story leading up to the point where you recognized, you know what, I think I've got a problem and I need some help with it.
So I'm afraid I'm not going to tell you that because okay. I didn't think I had a problem, or at least I wasn't ready to admit that I had a problem. I actually started with a new therapist in 2014, January. And that first visit with him, he's a therapist out of Houston, Texas, and we Skype, and I still see him. And I started with him because I wanted to deal with what was at the time my unwanted same-sex attraction, which had really made my life totally unmanageable. But I didn't know that was an addiction at the time. But I started with him, and on our first visit, I described to him what a typical day in the life of Harvey was, and it included usually at least 2 visits to escorts in any given day, except for the Sabbath. And it meant that I had to scream and yell at people in the office to make sure I could get out of the office in time to have enough time at lunch in order to see someone, and then to sneak around on the way home from work in order to stop with someone else again, or perhaps later in the day. It was crazy. And I described this to my therapist, my new therapist, and he stopped me in the middle of a sentence. And he says, Harvey, I have to ask you a question. And I said, sure, go ahead, shoot. And he says, if I asked you, is sex a need or a want in your life, what would you say? And I looked at him incredulously and I said, are you kidding? He says, it's a need. Isn't it everybody's need? It's like water. It's like air. It's like shelter. It's like touch for babies. I said, I need sex twice a day at least. I would love it even more, but at least twice a day. And he said to me, he says, I think you should try to find an S fellowship, which means a sex addict or sexaholic fellowship in Toronto. He wasn't aware of what existed here. But he just said, go find yourself a sex addiction fellowship because I think you probably need it. And that was an aha moment for me, because until then, I was 59 years old at the time, and I had never, ever had anybody say to me or even discuss the idea of a sex addiction.
Wow. So how long had you been living that daily process that you were basically sharing there, a day in the life of Harvey? How many years had that been going on?
Oh, probably around 20.
Wow.
Right.
Well, that's quite the aha moment to wake up to have somebody suggest that. So what was your initial reaction when he suggested, hey, go check out an S fellowship group and just see what you think about that? What was your initial reaction to that, both emotionally and verbally?
So I had been through some therapy in the last year and a half before that, and we had never, ever touched on this topic. It was like, what? What about what about John? How come John never mentioned this, And so that it was I was a little stunned. But at the same time, I knew that at the age of 59, my life was totally a hurricane. I was living a tornado, and I couldn't live like this anymore. So I was prepared to believe and to trust this man. We had a really good first connection. He's a strong faith-based person like myself. He's a little bit older than me, but he has a family. He's also same-sex attracted. And he also had been through a sex addiction therapy work, 12-step program. So we really hit it off. And I immediately felt a connection that this man, had walked my walk, had talked my talk, and I felt trust. So I just said, you know what? I've got to believe that he knows what he's talking about. I'm going to go.
What was it like leading up to that first meeting? Was there fear to walk in that door? Was there hesitation? And then let's talk about that first meeting.
Yeah. So in Toronto, the SA meetings, the SA website at the time did not offer any information on where meetings were. It was very cloak and dagger. You had to leave a message on a phone number and wait for someone to call you back. And you had to leave your number. That was scary. So I did it. But now I was I was waiting. In the meantime, there was a different S group that did publish its meeting list and its addresses. So that night, the next day, actually, I made plans to go to a meeting. And I showed up. It was January. So I had my hat on and I had my coat on, and I took none of that off. I sat in my coat, and I sat in a room with 32 people in the room thereabouts. Wow. It was a big meeting.
A big group.
All male except for one woman. And it was scary. I actually did say my name. And I did say that I think I'm a sex addict. And that was about all I said. I did not share during the meeting. There was a reading. I don't even remember what it was. I knew at the end of that meeting that I wasn't going to go back to that fellowship. It was a fellowship that did not have a strong definition of lust and a definition of sobriety. And I needed that. I realized that I needed that. And in the meantime, the SA phone person called me back. And interestingly enough, if I had stayed in that room that I was in for that meeting at 6:30 on a Sunday, I would have, at 8 o'clock, there was an SA meeting.
Oh, wow.
But I didn't know. So I didn't get to it. But I started going the next day. There was a lunch meeting that I started going to regularly. And I started my journey.
Wow. So your experience of going in, and trying to keep as anonymous as possible, wearing the coat, protected, wearing the hat, keeping it on. I think that's a fairly common experience for people going into a meeting for the first time. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who is, just either been told by somebody else, you might have a problem, or has come to their own realization, my life is completely unmanageable and I need to get help. So I need to reach out. What advice would you give to them in walking into a meeting for the first time?
The truth is, as an addict, I wouldn't have trusted anybody. I don't know if I could have really given you any advice. I guess if you knew somebody that you could go with, would probably be nice to have someone to be there beside you, hold your hand if that's necessary. But short of that, when I got into this program, I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust God. I didn't trust anybody. And it was a leap of faith to believe that this therapist knew what he was talking about, and he thought this was really important. And I really didn't think that I had the luxury of time on my side. And I knew at the age of 59, if I didn't get this now, I was never going to get it.
So you were, once that light was flipped on, hey, you might have an addiction here. You were ready, 100% ready in your own heart and mind to do whatever it took to take those steps, it sounds like.
Yeah, I had stopped acting out every day for probably 30 or 40 years.
Yeah.
Right. Every day I said, this is the last time. This is the last orgasm I'm ever going to have. This is the last, experience I'm ever going to have like this. I'm never doing this again, only to start again the next day.
Right.
Or even the same day.
Mm-hmm. I've heard and experienced that many times myself. Very powerful. So, I mean, we're going to talk and focus a little bit more on step 2, but getting to step 2, you have to recognize the step 1, and you've alluded to it. Your life's become unmanageable. Tell me what step 1 means and meant to you at that time.
Yeah. So, I actually wrote a few things down here just so I should get that feeling, be able to explain it a little bit clearly. In my experience, and in the work I do with others, I have decided that I have found that there are really 2 sides of the unmanageability. There's the external unmanageability, and then there's the internal unmanageability. And the external unmanageability are things like you lost your wife, you lost your job, you got caught watching porn in the office, you behaved badly with a patient, or you did something outside of yourself. You lost you screwed up at school, you didn't graduate, you messed up your courses, whatever. All of those things. And many of us have experienced more or less of that. Lost a lot of money. Those are all external unmanageabilities. And then there's the internal unmanageability. And the internal unmanageability, I think, is common to all addicts, whereas the external ones are going to be different because you may or may not be married. You may or may not get caught, in a park, God forbid, or in a bathroom, in a subway station, or whatever might have happened to that person. There's all kinds of stories.
Right.
But internally, I think we all share that many of the same kinds of feelings of people describe. I certainly felt empty. I felt that there was a hole in my heart where there should have been something spiritual or something special there. I felt isolated. I felt apart. I couldn't become a part of. I was apart from. I could feel alone in a room with 200 people.
Yeah.
I felt lost. I felt insane. I felt that I had lost my ability to make good choices. I felt like an animal, like I had no choice, that there was instincts working in me that did not allow me to be, to make good choices as a human being. My moral compass was in the toilet. I didn't know right from wrong half the time. And I would put myself into dangerous places in order to get my next fix. I was spending a lot of money and completely divorced from a relationship with my wife, with my children. It was really insane, So those are the internal things that I think are common to every addict to some extent.
Yeah.
And then there was powerlessness. I knew that I had tried, more religious behavior, more fasting, more testimonies, more, all of those things that, I had tried not keeping money in my pocket so that I wouldn't have money to spend on escorts or bathhouses or whatever. And I tried self-awareness things. I had tried promising myself. There's lists that go on and on and on of all the things that I tried. And I realized that none of them worked for any length of time. So I hope that answered that.
No, that does. And I just want to read from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous what step 1 says. It says, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, and we can substitute alcohol for lust in this case. Lust. Exactly. So we admitted we were powerless over lust, and that our lives had become unmanageable. So those are two, the powerless and the unmanageable, are 2 things that you really address there. Now, tell me how the word powerless came to your mind, and as the first time you read this first step, I'm powerless over lust and my life's become unmanageable. Had you grown up? Well, maybe I'll share my opinion of it previously. The word powerless
was such a weak word, and there was no way in the world that I would ever admit that I'm powerless over anything. If I can believe it, I can achieve it. Those types of things were so ingrained into my mind. Or, if there's a weakness in your life, it's your fault, which, whatever. But that word powerless was such a negative meaning word to me that when I first read these things, I was actually pretty angry. I was like, I am not powerless over anything. My life's unmanageable, absolutely, but this powerlessness. And it wasn't until I understood things more clearly that powerless meant something to me. Tell me your experience with that word. Is it somewhat similar to what I've shared?
I think so. Being faith-based, I think that's really what you're describing, is how I felt. If I felt that I had failed at being able to control this, it was a lack of faith. It was a lack of, not just not doing enough of what God would have wanted me to do or what my religion would have wanted me to do. Mm-hmm. And having to admit that I was powerless, in a society where certainly American, Canadian society, we're so trained and wired to never surrender, never mm-hmm. give up, fight to the finish, the last guy standing, never put up the white flag. So to admit that I have to say that I'm powerless, like you say, was something, I don't know if I got angry, but I certainly did not like the idea. Did not sit well.
That's just a very powerful part of this, is that admission of powerlessness. Anyway, so is there anything else on step one or any of your background story that you feel like you want to share a little bit more on before we jump into step two and talk a little bit more about that?
So, yeah, I would just say, when you get to step two, we're going to quickly get there. And the one word that really sticks out in step two is that, we understand that power greater than us can restore us to sanity, can relieve us of this insanity. Mm-hmm. So I think it really becomes very important for the addict to be able to reflect on and express and appreciate and stop denying their insanity. Insanity, as I think, is it Einstein, or that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Right.
That was me. And I had never wanted to admit that I'm insane, because here I am at 59, and reasonably successful in spite of my addiction. I managed mm-hmm. to raise family, have a home. I wasn't on the street behind some building, drunk or lost or something. I had a practice, I had a house, I had a car, I had a family. My wife hadn't thrown me out. It was, I hadn't really experienced a lot of the external unmanageability, but I knew that I was living an insane life. I knew I was insane. And I think it's really important to appreciate the insanity of where I was and where we are in addiction, in order to appreciate what our second step is going to be and what God can do. Yeah. Or whoever that is, your God,
right?
Your power, your higher power, as you call it, whatever.
Right. And step two reads, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So tell me that process for you of the coming to believe that a power greater than yourself, God, in your case, and in my case, brought you to that point.
So I think that when I did my first step, and I did it at a meeting with several people who I'll never forget. I think one of the most profound moments in the life of an addict as they come into recovery is sharing a first step in a room with other addicts who are there for you, who can appreciate where you've been. As I said before, walk the walk, talk the talk, have made you feel comfortable, safe. And I think safety is a huge word in the work that we need to do.
So before we move to the next thing here, I want to stop there for just a second. For someone who's listening who may not be ready to walk into a meeting or may not have an addiction themselves, but may have a loved one with an addiction, what does doing a first step in a meeting, in a group, look like?
Are you thinking about starting a podcast, launching a YouTube channel, or repurposing your old blog content? Then I have the podcast just for you. Hi, I'm Crystal Prophet, host of the Prophet Podcast. And as a content creator, I know firsthand what it's like to feel confused and overwhelmed with everything you could or should be doing. So join us every week as we strip down those processes and take all of that overwhelm away. We'll talk about the strategies I use to help creators start, launch, and market their content with confidence. If that sounds like something you're on board with, then click the link in the show notes and follow the Prophet Podcast today.
All right. Yeah. So doing a first step is basically coming to a meeting, sitting down with other people who are in, the other addicts, and having prepared a document that you read that describes your progression, your life since you were often a very little boy, but certainly a little girl, a young person, and how your early sexualization might have occurred, how you might have found lust as your drug of choice, instead of alcohol, instead of drugs, instead of gambling, instead of anger, instead of workaholism, because there's many drugs of choice. Today there's video games, and there's news feeds, and all kinds of different things that people become addicted to. Why I chose lust has to do with my early sexualization. I think I was first addicted to comic books. I would use comic books to escape, and I was Superman, and I was living in the Fortress of Solitude out in the Arctic somewhere. And I would fly away because my house was so crazy and I needed to escape. And then I found my body, and that was a lot more fun. Right. I ended up, lust was where I ended up. And in fact, same-sex lust was my template, and continued to be through my life. So I go to a meeting and I sit down and I describe my life, and it shouldn't be what we call a sexologue. It's not just supposed to be, a chronological description of how my disease manifested and continued to progress, and I got deeper and deeper and further along, and went down deeper into the hole. That's certainly part of it, because I need to express that. I need to appreciate that it's getting worse, because addictions get worse. We progress. The amount of drug that I needed when I was 14 is nothing like what I needed when I was 44 or 54. So it definitely is a progression. And I need to appreciate the progression. I think what I really needed to appreciate is the emotional changes and the emotional feelings that I had around how my life got more and more out of control. We talk about one of the things that you really want to hear in a first step is how many times that person, that addict, crossed a line that he never, ever believed he would ever cross. The bound, there's a line that says, I'm never, ever going to pay for sex. I'm never, ever going to go to a bathhouse. And then you go, and then you turn around and you look on the ground, and the line has disappeared, never to be seen again. You can't jump back over it again. You're there. And that's one of the things that the first step, is supposed to help us see and become aware once and for all of how powerless we've been, how many different ways we tried to stop and were unsuccessful for any length of time. And some of us have had moments and periods of time when we managed. Mine were very small, very short, and pretty much not there. Others have had better experiences, better. And certainly the unmanageability and how crazy my life feels, and how unmanageable, as we described before, your inner or the outer external unmanageabilities.
No, that's really helpful, that description of doing a step one, I think, and it's similar in all of the different fellowships. I'm,
sure
that you share your progressive relationship with that addiction, whether it's alcohol or gambling or whatever else that we can experience here. So tell me now about. Let's move into step two. Tell me that process, and then why step two is so meaningful to you in your life.
Okay. So once I was able to come to terms with my unmanageability, my powerlessness, and my insanity. I was very fortunate to find a sponsor. And I think this is, again, a key to the success of anyone in this program. It's really, really critical, I believe, to find a sponsor that has what you're looking for. If you don't feel the hope in the rooms, or especially in your sponsor, and you can't trust or respect that person for it, you're not going to find what you're looking for. Mm. And in my case, after 8 months of sitting in meetings in Toronto, I actually went to an open cocaine anonymous meeting. And the person who was running that meeting was a man named Cameron. And Cameron ran a tremendous meeting, and he just had a light on behind his eyes. Mm. And I sensed that light on behind his eyes. And I had not seen that light in anyone that I had met in the fellowship to that point. Mm. And I went up to him after the meeting and I shook his hand and I said, Cameron, that was an incredible meeting, and I'm not letting go until you promise to be my sponsor.
Wow.
And even though he wasn't a lustaholic, he wasn't actually a sexaholic at all. He was a cocaine and alcoholic, cocaine addict and an alcoholic, sober over 20 years. He agreed to be my sponsor because he could appreciate addiction. Even though he wasn't a sex addict, he understood exactly the emptiness that I was feeling, all the inner stuff that's, I think, common for every addict: the restlessness, the unmanageability, the discontentedness, the difficulty that I had with interpersonal relationships. I couldn't control my emotions. I felt useless. I was full of fear. Those things are common, I think, to everybody. And he agreed to be my sponsor. So when I finished my first step, the next step, it really isn't so hard to get to most of the time. I think it's harder. It was harder for me to get to a step 2 than a person with less religious background. I thought I had God. Because I lived in a faith-based experience. I'm an Orthodox Jew, and as such, I believed that I was living according to God's word and Bible and the commandments, and I ate kosher, and I kept Sabbath, and I went to Rosh Hashanah, New Year's, and all of that stuff, and. So it was a little hard for me to believe that, I needed to, God's going to do this for me. I've been praying to God for 40 years. He hadn't done anything for me, and my relationship to God was so, as it turns out, so dysfunctional, but I needed to be able to get to that point. And, reading the second step, I said, my first point was, what do you mean? Why hasn't he done it for me yet? He could have relieved me from, it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy and Glinda, the good witch, coming down. And she says, you've always had the power to go home. And she says, well, why didn't you tell me? And she says, you had to learn it for yourself.
I like that.
That's what I guess I had to do. I had to learn it for myself. I had a sponsor who could guide me and help me get there. But I really needed to find it for myself. And it's in my own backyard.
How did that experience of finding God for yourself happen in your life?
So my sponsor helped me with that. He does a process kind of that it's a two-part process. He believes that we need to fire the old God and then hire the new God. And he, because obviously I had a God that was not working for me. And it's hard to do that at the beginning because, it sounds awfully disloyal or somehow blasphemous almost to imagine that I'm going to fire God. My gosh, how can you do such a thing? But, so he described to me, he asked me to tell him, what my God was like. What kind of God did I have? I wrote down, that's what I have right in front of me here, a list of what God was like for me. And my God was angry, abusive, inattentive. He was shaming. He was abandoning. And in many ways, scary as it might seem, he was impotent because he couldn't really help me. He didn't seem to be able to help me. And all of those things are pretty scary thoughts about a God.
Yeah, how can you rely on a God like that, right?
Well, and what's even more so is that until you find the other God, which I have to hire, which is the second half of my story, I need to fire that one. And then, of course, I need to hire one because I can't. Obviously, step 2 is looking for me to find a higher power who can restore me to sanity. I have to have one, but I have to have one that in turn, in fact, has the opposites of all of these attributes so that I can actually surrender and have trust in that God, because step 3 is going to request of me that I surrender and I turn over my will and my life to the God who cares, right? And I just finished saying my old God didn't care.
Yeah.
You know, and he was supposed to be my concierge. So the way I describe it is I had a God, I was the Harvey Hotel, and he was my concierge downstairs in the lobby. And I would go to him and I'd say, can you get me tickets for the show? Or, you know, can you book me a room in a restaurant, a table in a restaurant down the street or whatever, as you can imagine a concierge. And that's kind of the way I treated God. I expected him to, snap, I'd snap and he'd jump. And of course, if he didn't jump, he was impotent,
right.
or I wasn't worthy. Really where I went because.
Right. The shaming part of what you said.
Exactly. Right. Obviously I have failed, right? I'm not strong enough. I'm not religious enough. I'm not devout enough. I'm not contrite enough. Whatever it is, I don't have enough contrition. I don't have enough, whatever. I'm not worthy of restoration, atonement, whatever religious wording you want to use. Right. I'm not worthy, right? And therefore, God has abandoned me, right? And he's not answering me because I have turned him into Santa Claus, right? God was my Santa Claus, right? And this is the time of the year, right? So right. So be good for goodness sake, right? He knows if you're bad or good, and be good for goodness sake, right? And I know, that sounds weird coming from the nice Jewish boy, but
no, I get it. That speaks to me. So yeah.
So I had to get rid of all of that because God doesn't love me conditionally at all. And I often ask my sponsees today, how does God feel about you before you ask for atonement, before you go to confession, before you ask to repent, before you admit you were wrong? How does he feel about you then? And I know what the answer used to be for me. He thought I was a piece of crap. And then if I did all those good things and repented or atoned or whatever you want to say, he might turn around and give me grace. But in my case, it had been so many years since I believed that I was worthy of any grace. I, in fact, was so far along in my addiction that I truly believed that God had so long ago left me alone, and he, in fact, had left me as the warden of my own personal prison so that I was here to punish myself.
So powerful. So now there's the God that you were in the process of firing, and I'm sure that's a really painful process. Now tell me the process from firing to hiring a new God. What happened there? Again,
my sponsor likes to actually sit down and take a piece of paper, Harvey, and write an advert looking to hire God, right? Just like you would if you were going to hire a secretary. Or a dental assistant or whatever I would do. He says, you're going to hire God. What would you like God to be? How would you like to imagine God would be, right? So, of course, we have all the cliched words of omnipotent, omniscient, which is part of the Judeo-Christian ethic, which is fine. Omnipresent was a hard one for me because, of course, I didn't think of him as omnipresent for me of all those years. So that one I had to push, a little bit and say, yeah, I really would like him to be omnipresent, And as much as I could believe that even in spite of everything I had been through and lived as in my addiction, I knew I had food in my belly. I had shirts, I had clothes on my back. I had gas in my car. I had a roof over my head. So I did believe that externally he had cared for me in spite of all of that, right? What I didn't believe is that he cared about the inside of me, right? And I like to put it as, today I understand that God really cares about how Harvey's doing in the sandbox of life. And I go back to that because as a lot of this is inner child stuff, as anybody in therapy will tell you, right? Going to a park and playing in the back in the park and playing in the sandbox and appreciating that your parent cares if they are that kind of person. They want to know how you're doing in the sandbox. Did you have friends? Did they bully you? Was it fun? Did anybody throw sand in your eyes? How did that go? How are you doing in the sandbox of life? And I needed to find that God. So I wanted a God who was going to be there with me and care about how I played in the sand and how I was managing with my friends, with my wife, with my children, with my patients, with my friends in my community. That was really something that I had at this point really not experienced. And that was something new for me. That's the hiring I needed to do. I needed to hire somebody who worked 24/7, no breaks. That was part of having to give up being God, because part of the first step, I think we should go back quickly for that, is because of low self-esteem, which I think is one of the core beliefs, core parts of an addict. I think we all share that low self-esteem. It's inversely proportional to the ego that I need to present in order to get by and to be able to live my life. Right. And part of that ego is this grandiosity that pretends and acts kind of like God. I want to run the show. I have to run the show.
Right.
I need to manipulate and control everything, because otherwise I don't feel safe. Right. So I'm controlling. I'm God, So God and I were partners in the old days. So I've given up that partnership. Thankfully, I sit in the back seat of the bus, as they often talk about in addiction world. I let God do the driving, and I had to do that. I had to say, you know what? I'm going to hire you to do the driving, and I'm going to let you do the driving. And I have to tell you, I'm still in spiritual kindergarten in a lot of ways. And part of that manifestation is, I sit in the back seat, and I'm really okay with that. But every so often, I lean over the seat and I check out the GPS. Where the hell are you taking me, God? So that's still where I'm at. I have faith that he's driving the bus, and I'm usually okay with it. Every so often I wonder, what the heck, why are you doing this? So I have to get to acceptance and appreciate that, again, the God that I found in step 2, which was, again, someone I needed to hire, was a God that loves me unconditionally. And he loves me so much that everything in my world is for my best, whether I understand it or not.
So in this hiring process, first of all, about how many candidates did you interview as you went through this process before you hired this new God? It almost sounds sacrilegious or blasphemous to talk about it this way, but I totally get where you're coming from. I'm really grateful for this perspective of it. So tell me about that. How many candidates did you interview in this process?
I'm still interviewing, I think, sometimes. I hired the only one who showed up. There was only one God who actually showed up for me.
I love that.
But I think that him and I are, like, as I said, when I go over to look at the GPS, what I'm really doing is questioning whether I really want to continue to have him working for me, or continue to have that relationship. And I don't want to do that. So I rehire him on a daily basis, I think.
On a daily basis. I like that.
I think so.
Now, how has this visioning or re-understanding of God affected your own understanding of your faith tradition, or maybe clarified things or reinforced things even? Tell me about that little process there.
So in Orthodox Judaism, I was actually not brought up in a religious world. I got there soon after my father took his own life when I was 12. So I became more religious, and I picked up a religious following, connection as a teenager. But the prayers were very rote. The connection that I had, I prayed 3 times a day, but I don't think I really understand much of what I was saying. It wasn't a very personal relationship. So I think the probably the most profound difference in my life today is appreciating the personal touch, the personal connection. I know today, having done all the steps, and when you get to step 11, you learn about prayer and meditation. Meditation is something I picked up really early on. My sponsor asked me to start doing it even before I started step 1. It was one of the step 0 things that we did. He describes it as, if you want to have a relationship with anybody, God included, if you're doing all the talking, you're a dictator, right? So part of a relationship that you want to have with God is, or whoever that higher power is, I call him God, you have to talk, and then you have to shut the hell up and listen. And I think that's what meditation is. And the other thing is I have to talk, and I have to talk in a language that I understand, because, of course, before I open my mouth, God knows what I want to say. So I'm really talking to him so that I can really appreciate what I need and what I want from him, and the nature of the relationship that I'm looking for, because he doesn't need that help. He knows exactly what's going on in my head, but I need to know what is going on in my head. So when I speak to him, and I'm vulnerable, and I'm open and transparent, and I'm weak or strong or whatever, and I'm able to say what's on my mind, that was very brand new for me. That was not something that in my religious background I had ever done. My very first sponsee was my second sponsee. My second sponsee was a evangelical pastor. And I thank him every day for having taught me how to do intentional prayer. Because I didn't know how to do intentional prayer.
That's really cool. And I want to stop there and talk a little bit more about the religious actions taken. I'm assuming you still pray 3 times a day, and a lot of those physical manifestations of your religion are still there, just like they have been for decades and decades. But it's a different approach from you, right? It means something totally different. Am I interpreting that correctly?
For sure. I still pray, as you say. I still pray 3 times a day. I'm still as careful about what I put into my mouth. I'm still careful about my prayer time, my blessings, before eating, after eating, all of the things that I did all my life, I still do. And it's interesting that you brought that up, because, there was that moment when I do that firing, when we talked about firing God. Many people experience this feeling of blasphemy, this feeling of disloyalty, and almost feel that, I'm giving up my religious faith. I have to dump it, I felt that a little bit, but I continued to go through the motions and stayed faithful to my religious background all through that episode, through that time. And then I was able, thankfully, and I think this is going to be true of everybody eventually. So for some, it takes a bit longer, I believe, but I think that eventually there's a fusion. There's you come back, and there's a kind of you can reconnect the new experience of the relationship I have with who is my higher power, my God today, with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that I had been praying to.
Right.
Praying about, living in my religious existence. And I kind of fused them back. And today, everything I do is just being done with a different emphasis, perhaps. I study scripture. I study, Talmud, as we call it. Today, when I study it, it's something that I think of as my step 11, because every day I need and want to grow my relationship to God, to my Father in heaven. And the way I do that is to study his word, to study what he's given us, what he's brought down into this world through Sinai or whatever you want to call revelation.
Right.
And I want to have that greater experience of him. And the way I do that is by trying to learn more about what he's shared with us about who he is and how his existence. And I see that through science and the wonderful miracles of nature that I can see today. And I look upon it as, wow, God made a butterfly. God made a cocoon that turns into a butterfly. I always saw that. I knew that as a little boy, but I think I look at it in a different way today because it's all about reminding me on a daily basis that I need to have and reestablish a commitment and a connection to him every day of my life. And that is the way that I can stay in my recovery so that I can, and it's a priority that I think supersedes my life, the rest of my life. If I stop breathing, it's like stopping this connection. I need to have all of that in order so that I can have a wife, so that I can have relations to children, I can have patients, I can have a community. It's a prerequisite. It's the foundation of my existence today.
So because this conversation with Harvey was so powerful, I split it up into 2 weeks. It was a long conversation, and so we're going to do that here also. I'm going to split it up into 2 episodes. So come back on Monday, December 5th, for the second half of this episode. But this is really powerful. Thanks again for your support of RECO12. If you find value in these meetings and in these episodes, please consider donating and rating and reviewing in the podcast platform of your choice, and also sharing it with your recovery network. What powerful concepts these are, at least for me. And if for me, I'm sure there's somebody else out there that needs to hear these concepts, even if they've been in the rooms of recovery for many years. Anyways, remember, there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now. Keep coming back. Let's trudge this road of happy destiny together.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am, still standing tall, despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storms and walked through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight, still searching